In the suffocating haze of August 4th, 1892, the small industrial town of Fall River, Massachusetts, stood frozen in anticipation of something inevitable. The sun had not yet reached its zenith, but the heat had already become unbearable, penetrating through the thick curtains of Victorian mansions and settling like a heavy burden on the shoulders of its inhabitants. At number 92 2nd Street, life flowed in a long-established, almost mechanical routine that had not changed for decades. The head of the household, Andrew Borden, a man of strict morals and phenomenal thrift, left his dwelling early in the morning to attend to business at the bank and oversee his numerous investments. He was the embodiment of the old order, a man whose fortune was measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars, yet whose daily life remained absurdly ascetic. His house lacked even the basic amenities of the time, such as indoor plumbing on the upper floors, creating an atmosphere of staleness and hidden discontent that had accumulated over the years beneath layers of heavy wallpaper and oak panels. The silence of that morning was broken only by brief dialogues between the residents of the house and the rare sounds of housework. The younger daughter, 32-year-old Lizzie, came down for breakfast after her father had already left. Relationships in this family had long resembled a Cold War, where the front line ran across the dining table. The stepmother, Abby Borden, whom Lizzie and Emma officially referred to as Mrs. Borden, was an object of quiet but deep alienation. On that fateful day, Emma was absent, visiting friends, leaving Lizzie in the confined space of the house with her stepmother and the maid, Bridget Sullivan. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, when Andrew Borden returned home to rest from the heat on the sofa in the living room, no one in Fall River could have guessed that in a few minutes, the tranquility of New England would be torn to shreds by an event that would forever enter the annals of criminology as one of the most sinister and unsolved mysteries. Lizzie Borden's scream, calling Bridget for help, marked the beginning of a new era for the town. She found her father in the living room, and what she saw left no doubt that his earthly journey had ended in the most tragic way. The respectable banker's face was practically unrecognizable due to multiple mechanical impacts inflicted by a sharp, heavy object. Soon, when neighbors and the first law enforcement officials arrived at the scene, Abby Borden's body was discovered in the guest bedroom on the second floor. She had died first, approximately an hour and a half before her husband. The bloodied blade, hidden from view, transformed an ordinary residential house into a labyrinth of riddles, where every witness testimony contradicted another, and the absence of signs of forced entry indicated that the source of danger was within those walls. Fall River at the end of the 19th century was a city of stark contrasts. On one hand, thriving textile factories generated colossal capital. On the other, a rigid social hierarchy and puritanical morality that did not forgive deviations from the norm. Andrew Borden, despite his wealth, deliberately chose to live in a less prestigious neighborhood, closer to his business interests, which caused hidden irritation among his daughters. Lizzie and Emma felt trapped in a social vacuum. While their peers from high society enjoyed trips to Europe and lavish receptions, they were forced to economize on trifles under the supervision of their father, whose stinginess had become legendary. This financial and psychological oppression created fertile ground for an internal explosion. The question of inheritance caused particular tension. Shortly before the events described, Andrew had purchased property for his wife Abby's relatives, which the Borden sisters perceived as a direct infringement on their legitimate interests. Quarrels over property became regular, and the atmosphere in the house turned toxic. A few days before the tragedy, the entire family suffered from a strange indisposition, which Abby Borden attributed to a possible poisoning attempt, although the doctor blamed it on poor quality food stored in the heat. These details, which emerged later, began to form a complex mosaic of suspicion. Lizzie Borden, an active churchgoer and member of a Christian temperance union, seemed the last person capable of violence, yet it was behind her flawless facade that the deepest cracks lay hidden. The investigation, launched by the Fall River Police, faced incredible public pressure and a lack of experience in solving crimes of such magnitude. The detectives' attention almost immediately focused on Lizzie. Her testimony during the inquiry was confused and often changed. She claimed that at the time of the incident, she was in the barn attic searching for fishing sinkers. However, the unbearable heat of that day made staying in the enclosed wooden structure practically impossible. Furthermore, no obvious traces of what happened in the house were found on her clothes, which seemed physically impossible given the nature of the injuries inflicted on the victims. However, a few days after the incident, Lizzie committed an act that many considered an admission of guilt. She burned one of her dresses in the kitchen stove, claiming it was stained with paint. The external layer of the conflict, presented by court records and newspaper headlines, exposed the helplessness of criminology at the time. In 1892, science did not yet know about dactyloscopy or genetic material analysis. The police relied on circumstantial evidence and intuition. An axe with a broken handle covered in ash was found, suggesting an attempt to conceal the weapon, but there was no direct evidence of its use. The city was divided into two camps. Some saw Lizzie as a cold-blooded criminal seeking freedom and money, others as an innocent victim of circumstances and police arbitrariness. The trial, which began in June of the following year in New Bedford, became a national spectacle, comparable in intensity to modern media shows. Lizzie Borden's internal conflict was far deeper than a simple thirst for gain. It was the drama of a woman whose ambitions and desires were suppressed by the patriarchal order. At 32, she remained unmarried, completely dependent on her father's will, who controlled her every step and every cent spent. The conflict with her stepmother was not just a dislike of an outsider woman, but a symbol of the struggle for recognition and status within the family. Lizzie saw Abby as a barrier between herself and her father's affection, as well as a threat to her future well-being. Every decision Andrew made in his wife's favor was perceived as an act of betrayal. In the quiet of the house on 2nd Street, a solution was brewing that was meant to cut all the knots that bound her hand and foot. Her behavior during the trial was an object of close scrutiny by psychiatrists and journalists. She maintained an icy calm, interrupted only by rare moments of weakness, which many considered to be a carefully rehearsed act. When the skulls of her parents were presented in the courtroom, Lizzie fainted, which made a deep impression on the jury. But was it a reaction to grief, or to the horror of realizing what she had done? Lizzie's personality eluded definition. She was her father's daughter, equally strong-willed, secretive, and unyielding. Her internal struggle lay in an attempt to maintain the dignity of a true lady, while at the center of a scandal that destroyed the very foundation of Victorian notions of feminine nature. The ideological conflict of this case touched upon the fundamental pillars of 19th century society. At the heart of the discussion was the question, could a woman from a good family, raised in strict religious traditions, be capable of such a cruel and cold-blooded act? In that era, women were believed to be biologically and morally unfit for violence of this kind. The very thought that a respectable parishioner could commit such a deed undermined faith in the stability of the universe. Lizzie Borden's defense masterfully played on these prejudices. Lawyer George Robinson, a former state governor, appealed to the jurors' emotions, arguing that only a, quote, "one could commit such an act," and before them sat a fragile woman whose upbringing and background served as the best alibi. This conflict of ideas revealed a deep contradiction between the reality of the human psyche and social constructs. Society preferred to believe in the myth of the quote, _to_, even if the facts pointed otherwise. Lizzie Borden's acquittal became less a triumph of justice than a victory for the status quo. The all-male jury simply could not allow themselves to admit the possibility of such darkness within a woman of their circle. This would have meant acknowledging that danger could emanate from their own daughters and wives, that social order was merely a thin film over an abyss of uncontrolled impulses. Thus, the court verdict became an act of collective defense of an idealized image of womanhood. The transformation in the perception of the case occurred when the legal procedure clashed with the relentless logic of facts that could not be ignored, yet were rejected by the court. A key turning point was the judge's decision to exclude from consideration Lizzie's attempt to purchase prussic acid the day before the incident. This evidence directly pointed to premeditation, but was deemed irrelevant due to legal technicalities. From that moment, the process ceased to be a search for truth and transformed into a formality aimed at clearing the defendant's name. However, it was precisely this legal salvation that created a paradox. Lizzie Borden was free under the law, but forever remained condemned in the eyes of history. The situation drastically changed for Lizzie herself after the verdict. The expected triumphant return to society did not happen. On the contrary, she encountered an invisible wall of alienation. The town that had so fiercely defended her initially, after the acquittal, slowly began to turn away. This was an unexpected revelation for a woman who expected that wealth and official innocence would open doors to high society. The transformation from presumed victim to social outcast happened almost instantly. Lizzie discovered that, having escaped the physical shackles of parental control, she had entered a prison of public opinion, from which there was no escape. The culmination of this story did not occur in the courtroom, but in Lizzie's subsequent years in Fall River. Having inherited a vast fortune, she and her sister bought a luxurious mansion on the Hill, the very neighborhood her father had never allowed her into during his lifetime. She named the house Maplecroft and tried to start life anew, changing her name to Lizzie Borden. But the final confrontation with reality occurred when even her loyal sister Emma could not bear the atmosphere of the house and left Lizzie forever in 1905. The reasons for their rift remained a mystery, but many believe that Emma learned something that made cohabitation unbearable. All streams of this drama converged at one point, in the solitude of a woman amidst luxury, for which an unimaginable price had been paid. The resolution of the Borden case demonstrated that true justice is often meted out outside the walls of state institutions. Lizzie lived in Maplecroft until her death in 1927, surrounded by servants and pets, but almost completely devoid of human interaction. The townspeople avoided her house, and children sang the famous rhyme about 40 axe blows in the streets. The moment of truth was that the acquittal did not bring her peace. She remained a monument to herself, a symbol of an unsolved mystery, frozen in the amber of the Victorian era. Her life became living proof that some deeds cannot be washed away by any verdicts. The resonance of the Lizzie Borden case continues to be felt today, more than 130 years later. This story teaches us lessons about the nature of human perception and how easily social filters distort reality. In our time, we see similar processes when a person's media image completely overshadows the factual side of the matter. The incident in Fall River shows that prejudices, class, gender, or religious, can become an insurmountable obstacle to truth. We learn from this a lesson about the fragility of the justice system, which, being a tool of humans, inevitably inherits their weaknesses and delusions. The lessons of this drama remain relevant, reminding us that destructive forces can hide behind the closed doors of the most prosperous homes. This is a universal truth about the human psyche. The suppression of emotions, strict control, and a lack of empathy inevitably lead to catastrophe. Today, analyzing the events on 2nd Street, we understand that Lizzie Borden was not just a participant in a crime chronicle, but a symptom of a sick society that preferred outward propriety to inner truth. The significance of this story lies in its ability to make us doubt the obvious and seek answers where we are afraid to look. Returning to that sweltering morning of August 4th, 1892, we again see the quiet house and locked doors. We hear the measured ticking of the clock in the living room, where Andrew Borden lay down to rest, unaware that this rest would be eternal. The hook that caught the attention of the whole world at a deep level of understanding turns out to be not just a question of, quote, one, but a question of, quote, two. The story of Lizzie Borden is a mirror in which our own unwillingness to see the darkness behind the facade of virtue is reflected. It brings us back to the idea that the boundaries between order and chaos are much thinner than we would like to believe. The final thought that resonates through the decades is the realization that some mysteries must remain unsolved to serve as an eternal reminder of the complexity of the human soul. Lizzie Borden took her truth with her to the grave, leaving us only conjectures and endless interpretations. But therein lies the power of her story. It does not let us rest, forcing us to return again and again to the stuffy rooms of house number 92, where time stopped at 11 o'clock in the morning. We look at old photographs, peer into the calm face of a woman in a strict dress, and understand that the truth is always somewhere nearby, hidden beneath layers of ash and forgotten memories, waiting for someone who dares to look behind the curtain of history. A walk through modern Fall River inevitably leads the tourist to that very house, which is now a museum. People come there to touch the legend, to feel the very atmosphere that once pushed a person to the extreme. This pilgrimage to the scene of the tragedy emphasizes our eternal need to unravel the mysteries of the past. But perhaps the most important secret is not what actually happened, but how this event changed us. We have become more skeptical, more attentive to details, but at the same time remained just as vulnerable in the face of the incomprehensible. Ultimately, the story of Lizzie Borden is a narrative about the loss of innocence for an entire society. After that fateful August, the world could no longer seem the same, safe, and predictable. Every time we encounter something inexplicable, we involuntarily recall the woman who burned her dress and continued to live in a city that considered her guilty. This is a symbol of our common journey, through doubt, through the search for justice, and through the realization that some wounds never fully heal. And as long as the house on 2nd Street stands, as long as the memory of those 40 blows lives on, we will continue to search for answers, understanding that the process of searching itself is far more important than the final conclusion. Concluding this long journey through time, we understand that Lizzie Borden became part of our cultural code not because of the brutality of the act itself, but because of the paradoxical combination of ordinariness and exceptionality it carried. Life goes on. Generations succeed one another, but the shadow of the axe still falls on the pages of history, reminding us that human nature remains unchanged in its deepest manifestations. We close this book, but the questions remain, swirling in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam, breaking through the heavy curtains of a Victorian mansion on a hot August day. A thorough analysis of all the circumstances of the case shows that the Borden family's social standing played a crucial role in shaping the defense strategy. If Lizzie had been a poor immigrant working in one of Fall River's textile mills, the verdict would undoubtedly have been different. This aspect highlights the inequality before justice that existed then and, to varying degrees, persists today. Andrew Borden's wealth, which he so zealously guarded, ultimately served as a shield for his daughter, paying for the best lawyers and creating an aura of respectability around her that the jury dared not shatter. Furthermore, the influence of the press of that time cannot be ignored. The newspapers of 1892 behaved as aggressively as modern tabloids. They created narratives that dictated public opinion. First, Lizzie was a, quote, 0, then an, quote, 1, and after the trial, a, quote, 2. These media transformations show how easily a human personality can be disassembled and reassembled to please the public. Lizzie Borden was the first true media star of the criminal world, whose fame was built on a foundation of unspoken words and suspicions. Andrew Borden's psychological portrait also deserves attention. His maniacal drive for economy was possibly a form of family control. By depriving his daughters of comfort befitting their status, he deprived them of agency. In such an environment, violence might have become the only available means of communication, a radical cry for help or an act of ultimate liberation. We see how financial pressure escalated into psychological pressure, creating an explosive mixture that only needed a spark to destroy everything around it. And that spark was an ordinary summer day when the air temperature exceeded all imaginable limits. Considering the ideological component, we encounter the concept of Victorian repression. The entire way of life of that time was built on concealing true feelings under a mask of propriety. The Borden home was a perfect example of such a structure. Outwardly respectable, inwardly torn by conflicts. The incident in Fall River became the moment when this mask cracked, revealing to the world what was hidden behind it. It was a clash between ideal and reality, between who we want to appear to be and who we truly are. And this conflict remains central to human civilization to this day. Lizzie's own transformation in the post-trial period reveals another facet of her character. She did not flee the city, did not hide. On the contrary, she stayed to remind her neighbors every day of their defeat. Her life at, quote, 0 was an act of quiet defiance. She spent her father's money on things he despised: art, theater, travel, and luxury. This was her personal victory over his shadow, over his stinginess, and over his rules. Every purchase, every reception in her new home was a blow to the order that had suffocated her for 32 years. The culminating moment of the break with her sister Emma in 1905 is often overlooked, but it is key to understanding the atmospheres surrounding Lizzie. Emma, who had supported her sister throughout the entire process, who had been her main support, suddenly left and never communicated with her again. This departure is the loudest testimony of guilt, which needed no words. It tells us that even the most devoted love cannot bear the weight of a certain truth. Lizzie's loneliness in her last decades of life was not merely the absence of people, but the presence of something invisible that made any intimacy impossible. The resonance of this story in popular culture, books, films, operas, and even musicals, confirms our obsession with this plot. Again and again, we try to reconstruct events, search for new clues, build theories about accomplices, such as the maid Bridget or a mysterious stranger. But each time we return to the same figure, the woman in the blue dress standing on the threshold of the living room. This eternal return suggests that the Borden case touches some very deep, almost archetypal chords in our consciousness. It is about rebellion against the father, about the struggle for freedom, and about the exorbitant price one has to pay for it. The contemporary significance of this story is also linked to technological advancements. We view the Borden case through the lens of modern forensics and understand how many opportunities were missed. If the police had preserved the dress, if they had checked Lizzie's hands for microscopic traces, if they had conducted a thorough autopsy, everything could have been different. This is a reminder that scientific progress is not just an accumulation of knowledge, but an expansion of the boundaries of our responsibility. We can no longer afford the luxury of ignorance that saved Lizzie Borden in 1893. The final chord of this symphony of mysteries brings us back to the beginning. Fall River Street, silence, heat. We understand that the story never ends. It merely changes its forms, flowing from newspaper articles into scientific works, and from them into legends. Lizzie Borden remains with us as a living question, as a reminder that behind every facade lies its own drama. And in this eternal movement from hook to resonance, we find a reflection of our own lives, our choices, and our secrets. We leave the house on 2nd Street, but it forever remains in our memory, reminding us that truth is not what is proven in court, but what we are left alone with in the silence of our own thoughts. Understanding this story requires us to abandon simple answers. Lizzie Borden was neither a 100% monster nor an innocent victim. She was a complex person, a product of her time and circumstances. Her tragedy is the tragedy of unfulfillment, suppression, and a social dead end. And in this sense, she is much closer to us than it might seem at first glance. We are all, to varying degrees, trapped in our houses on 2nd Street. And the only question is how we resolve our internal conflicts. A final look at Fall River reveals a city that has outgrown its legend, but has never been able to shake it off. Lizzie Borden is its most famous citizen, its shame and its pride simultaneously. Her story is fuel for the tourism industry, a topic for endless discussions, and an eternal lesson on how dangerous it is to judge by appearances. We conclude this narrative knowing that tomorrow someone else will again open the door of number 92 and ask, "So what really happened there?" And the silence of the Victorian rooms will again be their answer, keeping it secret until the end of time. Every detail of this case, from the uneaten breakfast to the burned dress, serves as a brick in the edifice of the greatest mystification in American history. We see how facts dissolve into myths, how a real person turns into a character of folklore. And perhaps this is the true completion of Lizzie Borden's life journey, in her final transition from the world of the living into the world of symbols, where she found that very eternal life that was so often spoken of in her parish church. Her earthly journey is complete, but her story only begins with each new listener. This narrative, built on escalating tension and deep psychological insight, brings us to a final realization. Truth is not always something that can be seen or proven. Sometimes truth is what we feel in the silence, when all words have already been spoken. And in this silence, Lizzie Borden continues her eternal journey, reminding us that history is not only dates and facts, but first and foremost, people, their passions, their fears, and their endless desire to be understood. We close this page, leaving Lizzie in her Maplecroft, among the shadows of the past and the echoes of that hot August day that forever changed the world.